Fundamentally, he's saying you have to do the work to change so that you can discover yourself. He specifically, when he referred to doing the work, was the work of always being inside ourselves, of being so focused on the opening of our heart, the establishing of ourselves in that space and the functioning from the consciousness that's there, right? From there, the extension of that space, the expansion of that openness into the flow of energy within inside, being able to to permanently establish yourself in this vertical flow and to be able to extend from that vertical flow into the horizontal. So that then there was nothing that was outside of work, because we have this internal process that's going on, and the making contact with that inner consciousness and the conscious extension of that into this apparent duality. For Rudi, every dynamic was about work. Rudi was a person who had one thing on his mind, and that was getting bigger, if you will. Finding a bigger space of consciousness, finding a bigger heart, finding a bigger surrender, finding a bigger willingness to give, etc. So you could really translate work into getting bigger, which was also a term that he would have used a lot, right? And fundamentally, what we're really talking about is the work of freeing ourselves from the ego, freeing ourselves from the grip of the limited consciousness that keeps us in a state of suffering and misunderstanding. And he called it work because, it's work, right? There's no pills that we can take, there's no magic wand, etc., right? It takes tremendous clarity of dedication to take on, if you will, the challenge of truly transforming our consciousness and therefore our experiences. And then the work is to free ourselves, and in this highest sense, to surrender everything that gets in the way of that which we say we want, which is to know God. And the fact that, it's work, well, that's God's fault. We can blame God that it's work, or we can do the work. What's really amazing is that we have to work so hard at being happy. The reality is we work really hard at being unhappy. We take so much of our life force and we pour it into every drama, every tension, every misunderstanding, every insult, everything. And that's how we deplete ourselves from our own life force. So we are unwilling then to surrender the very things that we say we want to let go of. And it demonstrates, if you will, the extraordinary power of the ego. You have to understand that until we are able to really get bigger than the ego, then it is the dominant consciousness in which we function. So let's get on with the work. Well, there's big things that you can do, and the biggest thing is to really open your heart, which is the very thing that people are afraid to do when somebody's spitting at them, right? I'm not saying sit there and take their abuse, but opening your heart to them is very different, right? Not closing in the face of somebody's tension is what really demonstrates our capacity to and willingness to open in the face of adversity, right? And by opening our heart, we are simply, there's two things that happen. One, we're not engaging from our mind, we're not fighting from our ego, right? We are then not responding to their tension from a place in us that can only respond from the tension in ourselves, right? We're responding from a place of openness that can accept that without having to change them, without having to do anything with it. The next thing is we recognize it's lunch. It becomes fuel for our own openness. And so we're not taking on their trip and their stuff, but we are understanding that that's energy, right? And that if we're conscious, we can absorb the energy and cycle it through our own mechanism and give us more nourishment for our own growth. More nourishment so that the next time they come swinging a sledgehammer at you, you have a bigger strength and a bigger capacity to open your heart, which is the very thing that you were trying to do the first time. It's counterintuitive, right? We were talking about it in the retreat. It's really the logic of open the heart, right? Which is not logical in any normal dimension of life that function for mind and emotion. It's not logical to open. The first thing we want to do is close. So then the thing that we're doing then is allowing the thing in us, the place in us that's not big enough to open to somebody else's suffering, right? To dominate our own place, our own experience. So we're relating to their tension really from a place of tension in ourselves, right? Okay, that takes work. And at some point, work has to be something we do in the moment, not something that we regret that we didn't do. We could certainly say the same thing about really finding some simple joy in our life. Let's make sure we do it now instead of looking back at our life when we're 80 and say, oh, gee, I could have done that. Well, it's the resistance to change. We've come up against a dynamic that is hard for us. Okay, fine. Don't beat yourself up, don't give yourself a medal, right? So it's hard. The point of the reason it's hard is that we're resisting understanding what it's trying to give us, resisting what it's trying to show us. And then the resistance dissolves when we understand that, right? But when we're fighting from the place that doesn't want to change, that doesn't want to know, then all it can do is resist. So as we say regularly, if you're not meeting your resistance, you're not growing. But you're not growing if you don't get past your resistance. It's a two-step process. It's a depth of surrender that allows a deeper consciousness inside us to recognize the level of consciousness that's functioning where the resistance is coming from in the first place. So we're letting go of that place that's in the fight. You can start with the fundamental truth. If there's a struggle, it's ego. If you start from there, then the next step is, okay, I don't want to function from this level of ego. I'll surrender this. Because if you're not functioning from ego, there's no struggle, there's no resistance. You don't. Your ego is not your amigo. Fighting it is just giving it energy. But you can surrender it. And by surrender, what we mean is by reaching deeper into a deeper level of consciousness in ourselves. And as soon as we make contact, right, with a deeper place, then we see the ego for the limited capacity that it functions in. And then the letting go is so easy. So it's not about killing the ego or this or that, right? It is about transcending it in the sense that we find a higher level of consciousness in ourselves. And so when I say all struggle is the ego, that's the alert. That's the email that says, wake up, something's going on here, right? But we don't do that. We see that email, we go, delete, right? Right? Right. So then it's not about fighting, it's about really finding a deeper consciousness, right? The ego never gets enlightened. It never even gets bigger. Well, actually, we shouldn't say that. It's right, right. So when you find yourself fighting with it, just stop and just relax and get quiet and really ask to find a deeper consciousness. So let's not fight with our ego or other people's. Let's forget about the ego. Sadhana is the continuous focusing on living from joy and openness and higher consciousness. Then the ego is this gnat thing. We don't care, it's over there, it's doing and buzzing around. So what? Right? So we don't put all this energy into fighting the ego, we put energy into opening our heart and finding deeper, simple joy in the experience of God in ourselves. So okay, then having done that, or in the process of that, your ego will get exposed over and over and over again. Well, that's what we were just saying. So we don't start, fighting and beating and screaming and moaning and pissing and farting about that. We just recognize it and we understand that that's the grip of this limited consciousness that we have trying to hold on to its own self. What does the ego ultimately do? What it does is suffer. Well, how are we going to get through suffering by more suffering? Let's get through suffering by finding joy in our life, by finding true, simple essence of presence in ourselves. Let's feed that dog something different. Mind and emotion are levels of consciousness within the ego. They don't exist anywhere else. Joy is not an emotion. Happiness is an emotion. Joy is a state of openness, a state of awareness. It is a state of consciousness, just like our mental and emotional constructs are states of consciousness. Why does the ego show up in the first place? Every level of consciousness shows up at once, from supreme consciousness to inert consciousness. Let's not worry about why we are caught in our ego. Let's worry about getting out of the grip of it. Because ego is simply misunderstanding. We are the same divine consciousness as God. We just misunderstand it. And the ego will never understand that.